Hey everybody, it is Dr. Jacobs, and this week we're going to be learning about early childhood. So I have a few different unit learning objectives that I'd like you to be able to do these things by the end of this unit. First, I'd like you to be able to identify and explain the related stages of cognitive development using the theory terminology appropriately. I want you to be able to explain the concept of theory of mind in your own words. I want you to be able to explain the common speech mistakes children often make in early language development. So we saw some of that in last week's unit, and then we'll also see more of that in this week's. I want you to be able to explain and provide examples of Vygotsky's zone of proximal development using theory terminology. I also want you to be able to identify examples of the different stages of play. I want you to be able to explain and identify examples of the initiative versus guilt psychosocial stage. I want you to be able to reflect on the 4 parenting styles to analyze the parenting style of the caregiver or caregivers you had as a kid. I want you to be able to connect the development of memory with other developmental theories. I want you also to be able to identify the pros and cons of using corporal punishment and other discipline techniques. All right, so let's get started. So early childhood, this is age 3 years old until the entry of formal schooling, or about 6 years old. And so, so far we've looked at prenatal development, infancy, toddlerhood. Now we're at early childhood. So in terms of cognitive development, our theorist for this is Piaget again. And so we move now on to something called pre-operational stage. And this is the second stage of the theory of cognitive development. So we remember the first stage was sensory motor, where children learn through their senses and their motor movements. And now we're moving on to pre-operational stage. And this stage is characterized by the inability to step back from one's immediate perceptions and think conceptually. Part of this deals with the working memory capacity of a child. So when we're younger, we have fewer slots in our working memory. And as we age, we expand until we get about 7 plus or minus 2 slots in our working memory. So if we look at working memory, this is the part of the memory that people refer to as the short-term memory, or the part of your memory where you're able to manipulate information and remember it while you're using it. But once you stop using it, it's gone forever if you don't encode it into your long-term memory. This stage is characterized also by something called centering. And so centering is when we're younger and we don't have a lot of this bandwidth for our working memory, that we tend to focus on the most striking element of something. If we have a child with typical vision, usually the thing that's most striking is a visual aspect of something. So they focus on that because they can't step back and think about more pieces of information at one time because they have that limited working memory. And so we have pretend play. This is when children start using objects beyond their intended use. And so Piaget would say that pretend play is super important for being able to solidify some of the schemas that they have about the way they think about the world. So for an example, kids might use a piece of cardboard as a cell phone, and they hold it as a cell phone. And that's usually a lot of times one of the first things that kids do now because they see that behavior modeled everywhere. So again, Piaget would say that this pretend play is super important to strengthen the schemas that they're developing while they're assimilating and accommodating new information into their schemas or restructuring their schemas. Egocentrism is also really characteristic of the stage. When people see the word egocentric, they often think of some really bad connotations to this word, more egocentrism in the form of narcissism. And that's not what this means at all. So when we're talking about egocentrism with children, this is the inability to see from someone else's perspective or to be able to understand from someone else's perspective. Okay, this stage is also characterized by 3 main concepts of causality. The first one is animism. The second is artificialism. And the third is transductive reasoning. So let's go through these individually to learn more about them. So animism is when we believe that inanimate objects have human-like qualities. So that's when we say, Barbie made me do it, or we might say, Chucky the doll is out to get me. So when we see scary movies that have dolls that come to life, which a lot of people fear, and being bad, they're actually drawing on that primal animism type characteristic of our thinking when we were younger, which is super interesting. We also have artificialism, and this is the belief that environmental characteristics can be attributed to human actions or interventions. So, for example, a kid might be like, a person needs to stop blowing so hard if the wind's really hard. So they're attributing the wind, which is a natural phenomenon, to a human. We also have transductive reasoning. And this is when a child fails to understand the true relationships between cause and effect. So often this involves believing that two unrelated events are related. And so, for example, syncretism is thinking that if two things happen at the same time, that one caused the other to happen. I think in our materials it talked about if a dog barked and a balloon popped at the same time, they might think that the dog barking caused that balloon to pop. Another example of this that some of you actually might believe is that full moons cause influx of visits in the ER, or full moons cause weird behavior or weird accidents that end up in the ER. And although people will swear by this, they've done tons of studies on it, and this is not true, right? So this is actually transductive reasoning. And then saying, well, I worked in an ER and I saw this happen, is actually a form of confirmation bias, because we believe that we're finding things to support our point of view because they're shiny and interesting. Remember that one time something happened, but when they look at ER visits across the moon cycles, there's no difference. There's also cognition errors. And so, for example, centration. So we talked about centering. This is centering or focusing on one aspect of something while neglecting other pieces of it. And so we see these errors happen in conservation, which we'll learn more about on upcoming slides. And these also deal with irreversibility. So let's get into that a little bit more. Oh, and class inclusion. All right, so conservation tasks. Piaget was really famous for having these different conservation tasks to see if kids understand that when you change the shape of something, that doesn't change how much there is or how much the amount there is. And so there was this really landmark type of conservation task where Piaget would have this glass of water, and then would have a tall vase that was empty. And he would take the water and pour it into the vase, and actually let's start back over on that. So he would have two glasses with water with the same level, right? Then he would take one of those glasses and pour it into that vase I was telling you about. And so when you sit them side by side, the water in the vase looks taller because it was thinner, right? So we know that the same amount of water is still there. But he would ask children, hey, which one has more water? And they would always say the vase had more water because it was taller. So what they were doing was they were centering or focusing on the visual aspect of it being taller than the other glass, but not remembering that it started out with the same amount of water because it was in the glass that was the same size and things like that. And so there's a whole bunch of these different types of conservation tasks that you'll be able to learn about in our module materials. So again, trouble with conservation. Let's review this a little bit. So conservation is knowing that the amount of something stays the same if you change its shape. All right. So again, kids in pre-operational stage struggle with conservation. This connects back to their working memory capacity and being able to stop back and hold multiple pieces of information in their brain at the same time. Some of this also deals with irreversibility. So because they have this limited working memory capacity, children have a hard time thinking that things that are done to something can be reversed. Okay, so if we go back and talk about the example I gave with the water in the glasses in the vase, thinking that, oh, you could just pour the water in the vase back into the cup, and then we'll see that it's the same level of water again. And so they have troubles with that, or or troubles with irreversibility in appearance and things like that. So if we're talking about conservation, I don't know how many of you have worked with kids, a whole lot, but if you have graham crackers, it's super important that if you have them in their full shape, that you give every kid the same thing, because if you break one in half, even though it's the same amount, kids will think that someone else has more because they have two instead of the one. So if you want anarchy at snack time with kids in pre-operational stage, you know what to do. So we also have class inclusion because we have that limited working memory capacity. Sometimes kids struggle to understand that something can be a part of a larger group. So for example, if you had these pictures that you see here on the screen of some dogs and some cats, if you ask a kid, hey, how many or are there more dogs or are there more animals? The kid is most likely going to say there's more dogs because they have a hard time understanding that dogs are dogs, but dogs are also animals. One of the landmark studies for this is they would use like candy, right? So if I had Skittles and gummy bears and there's, let's say it looks like there's more Skittles than gummy bears. And I'm like, hey, do you want the Skittles or do you want the candy? The kids will often say they want the Skittles if they're in this thinking because they have a hard time understanding that Skittles is a type of candy. So we also have problems with identity constancy, and I was actually shocked that our materials didn't include this information. But this is where children in pre-operational thinking have a hard time understanding that changes in appearance can be undone. This is a really super cute video. Hopefully, you get to watch and reflect on it. So in this video, they think it's the baby misses the dad's beard, but actually what's going on is that the baby doesn't realize that that's still her dad. All right, so this moves us on to theory of mind. This begins about age 4, and our materials struggle to really define this, but all theory of mind is basically recognizing that others have different perspectives than yours. And actually, some people still struggle with this as adults. And they have, if you have a person with autism spectrum disorder, this develops along a different timeline than typical development. This also is understanding that thoughts can be wrong. And how often do we think about that? So in APA style, so I know that we have an eclectic group that's taking this class, but in APA style, they say, actually, if you say, I feel that blah, 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 but you're actually saying a thought, that's incorrect, right? So we think thoughts, we believe beliefs, and we feel emotions. So a lot of times, because we have a hard time understanding that our thoughts can be wrong, and actually most of our thoughts are wrong, which is a whole different conversation. But we like to use the word to feel. I feel that today's going to be a good day. No, you believe or you think today's going to be a good day. But we use the word feel to soften it because we tend to understand that our thoughts are going to be wrong, but we don't like to pair that up with the word thoughts because still somewhere in us, we struggle with the idea that our thoughts aren't right sometimes. This is also the crux of cognitive behavioral therapy. And so cognitive behavioral therapy examines different thinking errors or cognitive distortions or ways that our brain lied to us or are wrong, and then tries to adapt those so that you can improve mood. So theory of mind, understanding that people have intentions, desires, beliefs, perceptions, and emotions different from one's own, and that such intentions, desires, and so forth affect people's actions and behaviors. So this is a little bit more of a fleshed out definition. This is the one that came from our materials. And so if we boil that down, it's realizing that people think differently, they believe differently, and that influences how they're going to act. We also have language development that we go through. Here I have a link, and I can include this in our module materials if you want it, but there's different speech and language developmental milestones that we go through at different ages. And so this little checklist has some of them from early development. And so if you're going to be a teacher, if you're a speech and language pathologist, if you are in any field that works with children, so social worker, counselor, psychologist, if you're going to be a police officer that works with children and specializes in juveniles, These are good things to have, that if you recognize something's going on, that you may be able to refer them out for additional assessment and maybe potentially interventions. And so we started some of this language development in the last unit, and I want you to remember that information while we continue some of these pieces for this. So with language development, within this age, they start understanding by about age 6, about 28,000 to 24,000 words. And they go from about 200 spoken words at 2 years old to about 2,600 spoken words at age 6. So this is for a typically hearing child and someone without a communication disorder. And so our materials actually butchered this and they had the wrong numbers. So they had the right numbers in one spot and not in the other. So this is the accurate information that you should know about expressive and receptive language. So again, the materials made a mistake on the number of words kids speak at age 6 in different parts. Y'all don't have the print copy of the book. When I prep the materials, I use a print copy, but just know that this is the right information on this slide. So what happens is our kids that go through this fast mapping, which is a process where words are learned really quick because they connect new words and pre-existing concepts that they already have. So they start gaining the structure. And once they gain that structure, they can learn things super quickly. And so the way that people learn, though, really can change depending on which culture they're in. And so ecological system theory really plays into language. So children learning verb-friendly languages like Chinese, so like Mandarin or Cantonese, and Japanese learn verbs a lot faster than countries like America, where the primary language taught in schools is English. So children learning English struggle more with learning verbs and typically learn nouns first. And so they kind of have a little bit more of a struggle. And this is just another example of how the macro system or the culture influences the development. So they also actually believe that this influences the way that people think about numbers and math. So in certain languages, it's a more intuitive approach to how we do numbers. But in English, we do some really weird things where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And when we get to 10, it switches where it puts the number first. So we have 11, 12, 13. So the three's in front, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And then when we get to 20, it switches again where it goes 21, 22, where the number is at the end of it. And so this actually, they think, may influence our ability to really master quantitative thinking, because the way in the language that we think in and learn in influences our ability in our neural pathways. So another mistake to add to the list from last week that's common in early language development is overregulation. And this is where people apply grammatical rules incorrectly. So for example, saying I goed there instead of I went there, because the suffix ed indicates past tense. And so that should be past tense there. So ed indicates past tense. And so if you have go, you add it on there, like, oh, that follows the rule. But it actually doesn't. That's overregulation. It's over applying a rule that you shouldn't. So another example would be saying foots instead of feet. Because the suffix s indicates plural form of a word. We know that's not always true, and that rule does not always apply, which is also another reason why English is such a tough language to learn for people. We also have our zone of proximal development. This is one of my favorite theories as well. Sometimes zone of proximal development is referred to as ZPD. That's an acronym that's used to refer to it. And our theorist for this is Vygotsky. And Vygotsky contended that what a child can do today in collaboration, tomorrow he will be able to do independently. And so I really love this quote from Vygotsky because it really illustrates the essence, like, and it makes sense, right? What you can do today with help from someone else. If you keep at it with that helper, eventually you're not going to need help and you're going to be able to do it by yourself. And so our materials did talk about this theory. They did leave out 2 of the zones. They did discuss them in the picture or the diagram of it, but they left out pieces. So our theorist again is Vygotsky, who was a Soviet researcher. And then so something that goes along with this theory is scaffolding. But Vygotsky actually didn't come up with this term. Other researchers came up with this term. And what scaffolding is, it's providing assistance as needed to someone while they learn. So for example, one way that I'm providing you all scaffolding is through creating these lectures. Another way is through providing fun videos that I think you should make sure that you're watching. So some of the videos that I include in our module materials are actually in our textbook materials, but in case you didn't watch them the first time, these are the ones that I think that you really, really should watch because they help deepen your learning. Another way that I provide scaffolding is I give you those unit learning objectives so that you can test yourself and study right while you're going through the materials, right? And so I also provide that in our perusal document where you can look at the unit learning objectives and you can write comments if you're struggling on one, or provide information on how this connects back to what you're doing, right? And providing you all these tools so that you can learn. So while kids are younger, they actually use private speech in the beginning. And this is when they're learning about things. And this is where they speak out loud to themselves while they learn to think in words. Sometimes people still do this. I don't know if you still do this or not, but when you're learning something new, sometimes you might walk yourself through it by talking out loud, right? So if you're learning a new instrument like drums, you might actually count out loud while you're learning syncopation. Eventually, this private speech or these words spoken out loud become inner speech, and you probably likely still walk yourself through things. But eventually, most people, not all, but most people will eventually stop talking. They'll close their mouth and they'll think inside their head in words, although not everybody has that ability. Okay, and so this inner speech is where you think in words. So when we look at this, and you can eventually pause to try to make this diagram in your notes, but stay with me for a minute while we talk about it. So the zone of proximal development is what the theory is named after, but there's actually 3 different zones. 2 of these were left out, but they explained what these zones were in the materials. They just didn't give its name. So our zone of actual development, these are tasks that we can do without help. Okay, so this means you need no help for it. What are some of the things that you think are in your zone of actual development right now? Likely tying your shoe is something that you can do on your own without help. Likely watching a YouTube video lecture is something that you can do without help. These are things that you could just do if you wanted. You don't need anyone to show you how to do it. You can just do it automatically. Then our zone of proximal development are these tasks that you can do with assistance. So for example, I'm in drum lessons, right? And so I'm learning to play drums. Could I do it by myself? Not really. That's why I hired a drum teacher who teaches me, oh, no, don't hold your hands like this, or you need to relax, or when you're doing this, keep the drumsticks closer to the drum head. But when you go on the one, make it louder and move it with your wrists. I have someone that's scaffolding my development. They're showing me and teaching me what I need to do to be successful at the task. What are some things that are in your zone of proximal development? Think about that for a minute. What are things that you can do and be successful at with help with scaffolding? Then we also have our zone of insurmountable difficulty. These are things that no matter how much help you have, you cannot do right now. You cannot do it at all. So for example, calculus is probably not in most people's kindergarten's zone of actual development or proximal development. No matter how much help you give most kindergartners, they're not going to be able to do calculus. And that's because they're not quite there yet. Maybe one day they can, but at that moment, it's in their zone of insurmountable difficulty. And that's typical development. Like if we remember about working memory capacity, if we remember about the type of thinking that's going on at age 5, this is not developmentally appropriate for them. And so sometimes students will ask, hey, well, will things always that are in my zone of actual development always be there? Or things that are in my zone of proximal development, will they always stay there? Or will they eventually move down and be in your actual development? Things change, right? As you learn and grow, hopefully you're not stagnant and you're learning new things, right? Hopefully the information that you're learning in this lifespan development class will eventually be in your zone of actual development. That's our goal, right? And some things that are in your zone of insurmountable difficulty won't always be there, right? And as you grow and you flourish, you'll be able to acquire new skills and thought processes and think more critically about things. And so these things change as you develop. The materials for this week also covered self-concept, and this is the idea of who we are, what we're capable of doing, and how we think and feel. So where do we get our self-concept from? Let's think about that for a little bit. So there's two different theories on this. One was the looking glass self, and this is looking at how others seem to view us and interpreting this as we make judgment about ourselves. We do this a lot as preschoolers or when taking on new roles as adults. So trying to reference what does someone else think about how we're doing in this new role or who we are as a person. And so I think I'm going to butcher this, so forgive me for this, but there's this meme that goes around on social media where they talk about how it's really important how you speak to your children, because eventually that's going to be the voice that's in their head as adults, and we probably have some of that. Like if we're thinking about things that our caregivers said to us when we were younger, and thinking about when you're doing something new, sometimes we hear that doubt or we hear that encouragement. And I think it's not just our adults, but like if we have romantic partners or just other humans, coworkers, we do tend to take some of that on. And it's part of this looking glass theory. There's also a theory of the I and the me. Our theorist for this is George Hubert Mead. And so in this theory, the I is the part of the self that is spontaneous, creative, innate, and is not considered about how others look at us or view us. It doesn't care. However, the me then is the social definition of who we are. And so according to this theory, at birth, we're all I. We don't care. We're just living our best life or being us. But eventually we incorporate the me in how we view ourselves. And we do that through interactions with other humans, telling us that we're doing things right or wrong, or praise or punishment. And we incorporate both of these in who we become. And this is known as taking the role of the generalized other. We also learn about self-control. Self-control involves both response inhibition and delayed gratification. So response inhibition is stopping the initiation of behaviors that could result in undesired consequences. So it's probably something that you want, but you stop it before it becomes a problem. You're able to inhibit those behaviors. And this is why when people say that when you drink alcohol, you lose your inhibition, which is, honestly, if we're looking at brain chemistry and what's going on when people drink, this is not true. It helps people become less inhibited, and sometimes they'll do things they wouldn't typically do. But also sometimes people just blame things on alcohol too. So maybe they actually wanted to do those things when they were sober, and then using alcohol as the excuse. So there's that side of it too. And then delayed gratification then is process of foregoing immediate or short-term rewards to achieve more valuable goals in the longer term. So for example, if you have high cholesterol, you might forego eating things that are fried, right? Because you want the more valuable goal of not having a heart attack, right? Or you might delay getting into a romantic relationship because you want to focus on some larger goal and you don't want that to get in the way of your goal. So the really famous study for this is called the marshmallow test. And so there's, these things where they would give kids marshmallows and they say, hey, if you don't eat this marshmallow before we come back, then we'll give you 2 marshmallows. And so they would test and see, hey, did the kids eat the one marshmallow, or did they wait and delay gratification to get 2 marshmallows, which was more valuable? And so, although there are some limitations to this study, the researchers found that the kids who delayed their gratification and waited for the 2 marshmallows typically had better outcomes in the long term in terms of success and employment and things like that. However, there were some things looking at like socioeconomic status and hunger and things that go into maybe limitations of the study. But still the results indicated that kids who did this, it predicted later achievement. So then we also have stages of play. So the first one is unoccupied play. This is not playing, just observing. So they're just standing somewhere. hanging out somewhere. Then there's solitary play, and this is alone and maintains focus on their own activity, so playing by themselves. We have onlooker play, which is watching others play but doesn't engage in it at all, so there's no interaction. There's parallel play. This is where a child will play close to but not with others. Sometimes kids will mimic the other kids' play but won't play with them. We also have associative play. So this is where they're interested in the people playing, but not in coordinating their activities with them. Sometimes there's a lot of interaction or overlap, but not, it's kind of more of a hot mess. And then cooperative play, this is interested in both the people playing and in the activity. So this is playing together with other humans. So then we move on to psychosocial theory. So so far we already had where we had trust versus mistrust. We learned about autonomy versus shame and doubt. And now we're moving on to our next stage. So again, our theorist for this theory is Erik Erikson, which is not his actual real name. And our third stage for this is called initiative versus guilt. Sometimes this is a really hard stage, probably the hardest for people to understand because they have a hard time differentiating it from autonomy versus shame and doubt. And then the next one that will be after this, which is industry versus inferiority. So let's spend a little bit of time fleshing out this stage. And so in this stage, children have a desire to take initiative or to think of ideas and initiate action. So have you ever heard someone say, I wish you would take the initiative? Or, and it may not be towards you, or maybe you've even said this to someone. What does that mean? When you say that you wish someone would take initiative, you wish they would just think of something and then do it, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you wish they'd be successful, but you wish they would just get a start and do something, right? So again, something that important to keep in mind that in this particular stage, this action doesn't have to be successful. It's just planning and then doing. All right. So in the stage, initiative versus guilt, this is from Erik Erikson's book, actually. And what he would say is that initiative adds to autonomy the quality of undertaking, planning, and attacking a task for the sake of being active and on the move. Where before, so talking about an autonomy versus shame and doubt, self-will, more often than not, inspired acts of defiance, so throwing tantrums, or at any rate protested independence. So in the stage prior, autonomy versus shame and doubt, kids are just wanting to do things on their own. They might just be defiant. They might throw tantrums. But in this stage, in initiative versus guilt, kids are wanting to plan and do just to do it. And then when we move on to the next stage, that's where it's more about being successful at things, but we'll talk about that when we move on to middle childhood. So the book goes over a couple different types of parenting styles. We're going to stick with the one that is the most commonly accepted. In all honesty, I had never heard of the other types of parenting styles that were mentioned in the materials, and I thought they were quite out of place. So I wouldn't worry about memorizing the other ones, but what you do need to memorize are these parenting styles that were developed by Diana Baumrind. And she actually did this research as part of her dissertation. And in this, she actually only developed 3 of the 4 parenting styles. Future researchers developed a 4th one, which we'll talk about. So to determine what kind of parenting style you have, there's 2 different things that you take into consideration, or 2 constructs that determine which type of parenting style you have. One is warmth or love. How warm are you and loving are you? And the other one is control, or how much are you able to get kids to do what they need to do? And so when we talk about these things, control is not always necessarily the negative connotation of the word, where you're controlling someone like manipulatively. The control is more about discipline, which also has a negative connotation to it, but we'll define that later in the slides. So for parenting styles, if you have high warmth and high control, they say you're an authoritative parent. You'll notice here that authoritative and authoritarian look very, very similar. Though there's different mnemonics that you can think of to be able to distinguish these 2 from one another. What I like to look at is the number of A's in the word, and I know that's silly, but if you look at authoritarian, there's more A's. So I think of that they're more of a bad word, right? So an a-hole, right? So the more A's, the more of a jerk they are. And so when we look at authoritative, these are warm parents that work with their children, that talk them through things, that still have high expectations for their kids, but they provide the love and support to get the children there. When we get to authoritarian, however, these are the parents, they a lot of times we'll call them drill sergeant parents, that have high expectations for behavior, but they don't provide that love piece. So you do this because I said so. And sometimes parents will say that, and they're not necessarily always authoritarian, but these type of parents don't provide that warmth and love. They just do this, and this. Um, and they expect their children to be behave in the way that they expect all the time without question and promptly. Then we have permissive parents. This is they provide a lot of love and warmth, but they have low expectations for their behavior. So permissive parents are often called the best friend parents. So these are the ones who don't care if their kids throw a kegger at their house underage, or will just be their best friends, but don't have expectations for the behavior of their child. And so those three are the ones that were developed by Baumrind. And this fourth one, which our materials called uninvolved, other researchers call it rejecting, neglecting parenting style, were developed by other researchers. And this is when they have low control and low warmth. They just basically kind of neglect their kids. And that one's really sad. So discipline, I told you all we'd get to this and kind of define it. So what is discipline? If you hear that word, what automatically do you think? So if you were in the face-to-face version of my class, a lot of times students will say that they think of spanking, or they think of punishment. And so when we're actually looking at discipline, it actually means teaching people to act appropriately or correctly or in a desired way. So if you're a disciplined human, that means that you can control your impulses, that you're doing what you need to do, right? So if we think about people who are in marching band, they're very disciplined, right? Wake up. And they might wake up super early or stay super late to be in marching band practice. They walk in step. They don't move when they're not supposed to. They follow commands. And so that is discipline. Or if you're a very disciplined athlete, you're on a training schedule and you do what you need to so that you can be successful. However, discipline typically has a negative connotation to it, which is not fun. And so when we're talking about discipline, a lot of times we think about operant conditioning as a theory that guides that, because we think of modifying behavior to get people to do desired behaviors and minimize undesired behaviors. And so let's look at operant conditioning again. So the materials actually did a pretty decent job of explaining positive, negative, reinforcement, and punishment. But I'm going to explain it here again because people really struggle with this. And I think although the book did really well with explaining the terms, they didn't provide very great examples. So I want to provide some better examples for you. So when we're always talking about behaviorism or operant conditioning, positive means to add. It does not mean pleasant. It does not mean good. It just means you're adding something. With this theory, the negative means to take something away. It doesn't necessarily mean bad. And then reinforcement means that you want to increase a desired behavior. So I'm going to speak in terms that behaviorists would be really angry at me for using, but I'm going to do this to try to help your understanding, but know that the words that I have on these slides are the proper ones, the ones that you should know. But the ones I'm going to tell you now are just so I can help add to your understanding and scaffold the development a little bit. So basically reinforcement, you see a behavior that you like and you want to increase that. Okay, so that's really important. And then with punishment, this is where you see an undesired behavior and you want to decrease it. So if we want to speak in not behaviorist terms, you see a behavior you think's bad and you want them to stop doing it. Okay, so now when we put all these together, we can have positive reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So when we look at positive reinforcement, usually people are really good at understanding this one. This is when you add something to increase a desired behavior. So for example, on your quizzes, if you do really good on your quiz and I send you an email that says, hey, keep up the great work, that's positive reinforcement. I saw that you were doing great on your quiz, so I gave you specific praise for doing that, right? And then so we also have negative reinforcement. So this is one is that people really struggle with a lot because they see the word negative. Negative means to take away, if we remember. Reinforcement means we see a behavior that we like and we want to increase it. So negative reinforcement is when we remove something to increase a desired behavior. And I don't know if your all's high schools did this or if you have any college professors that do this. But if you had a school where they said if you have perfect attendance, then for the semester, then you don't have to take the final exam, right? So most people would really like that, not to have to take the final exam if they didn't want, right? So we saw the desired behavior, perfect attendance, and then we take away some sort of adverse stimulus, in this case, a final, because we wanted to increase that attendance. Okay. So then we also have positive punishment. This is also one that gets confused sometimes. Remember, positive means to add, punishment means we see a behavior we don't like, and we want to get rid of it. So an example would be spanking, right? So someone applies their hand to someone's buttocks and as punishment for doing something wrong, right? So positive again does not mean pleasant, right? And most people would think that's not pleasant as a child. And then negative punishment then is to remove something to decrease an undesired behavior. So for example, this could be taking away a cell phone because a kid got all Fs on the report card. There's also different types of reinforcement schedules. So continuous is where you constantly present the reinforcer after every example of a desired behavior, which can be exhausting. We can talk about that. And then a fixed is you present the reinforcer after a certain number of desired behaviors. And I don't know if y'all know about this. They have started bringing it back in some places, but there used to be a program called Book It. And when I was younger, after you read a certain number of books, you got a free personal pan pizza from Pizza Hut. And so that would be a fixed reinforcement schedule. You read this number of books, you get this reinforcer. And then there's intermittent schedules where some desires are reinforced, but not all of them are. And so this could be, I'm going to give it a free extra credit point because you were in class today, but I don't do it every time, but I might do it like week 1 and then week 4 and then week 10. Like there's not a like predictable schedule. And so these different ones have different positives and negatives to them. So continuous reinforcement, always constantly reinforcing behavior, can be super exhausting. Some behaviors would indicate that this is actually really important when you first start trying to see a behavior. So if you're potty training someone, I used to have, I would put like Skittles in this little candy jar, and we'd make a big deal out of it. And so, I think I spoke to y'all, I have 4 kids myself. And so when it came to the last kid, we'd make a big deal out of it when they pottied every single time. And we had a potty dance and it was like a parade of children and me dancing through the house, and we had a song, and we'd go and we'd shake the candy jar with our little song, and we'd do it every single time my youngest went to the bathroom. And then as she got better at it, we'd kind of space it out and maybe not give it every single time. And because a drawback to reinforcing every behavior, sometimes if you don't kind of wean them off of that, then the kids will just stop the behavior immediately, and that's not what you want. Fixed is the same way. Like if you're doing something and you expect some sort of reinforcer. Notice I'm using the word reinforcer and not the word reward. Behaviors hate the word reward because a lot of times we'll get rewards that are not necessarily reinforcers. So I don't know if you've ever gotten something that was supposed to be a reward and you're like, I don't want this. I don't care about it. So reinforcers are things that increase the behaviors. the desired behaviors that we're wanting. So this one is hard also to generalize to regular life. So it's that the behaviors keep going when you stop reinforcing the behavior. But it's also good because then you're not constantly trying to reinforce every single behavior that's right. So for example, in the summer, I listen to music and I rate it. So I get to hear these different songs, but after every certain number of songs, I get a reinforcer for the work that I'm doing. So then we have the intermittent schedule. It's the one that's most resistant to extinction of or for behaviors to stop. I butchered that, so sorry. Their intermittent schedule is good because it's if you're trying to reinforce a behavior, it's the one that's most likely to have the behaviors that you're wanting to see continue, even when they're not being reinforced. But they're not super good at helping you get these behaviors learned in the beginning. And so there's positive and negatives to each of these types of reinforcement schedules. And it's important to keep in mind, no matter what kind of job you do, whether you're a teacher, or you're a parent, or if you're a manager of some sort, it's important that we're thinking about how are we reinforcing people. And it doesn't always have to be after every single thing, because it needs to be genuine. But it's kind of interesting to think about. So there's also functional behavior analysis. You may have heard of this before. Sometimes these are called FBAs. And so when we're thinking about functional behavior analysis, we first need to define what is a behavior. So think about that for a minute. So if I were to clap my hands right now, how do you know that I just clapped my hands? A lot of you would probably say that you knew that I clapped my hands because you heard it or you saw it, right? It's observable. And so when we're doing a functional behavior analysis, what we're trying to determine is what happens before a behavior, what happens during the behavior, what happens after the behavior. And then we use that information to try to determine what was the purpose of the behavior, the function of the behavior, so that we can develop a behavior intervention plan of some sort. So a lot of times we'll use the mnemonic ABC to remember this. The antecedent that we're looking for is we'll be noting what happens directly before this behavior occurs. Then we identify what the behavior is, the specific observable behavior. Something to note, behaviors have to be observable, right? So you can't say that person's sad. That's not a behavior, right? That's us guessing an internal state. We can say we think that somebody is sad because they are crying, right? Crying is the behavior because that's what we can observe. And then the consequences are what thing happens directly after the behavior. And so we use this information to try to figure out what we can do to help children. So let's do an example. I guess technically you could do this with anyone, adults too. So an example antecedent, the teacher assigns a really difficult homework assignment. The behavior, little Tommy throws a desk against the wall. And the consequence is little Tommy got sent to the principal's office, which is not a good thing with what's going on here. So if we're looking at this, we might be able to try to figure out why would little Tommy throw a desk against the wall? And you're looking at it and you're like, I think I know why. But to elaborate a little bit further, let's talk about functions of behaviors. So functions are the reasons that behaviors occur, and there's 3 of them. There's always either to get something, to avoid something, or some form of self-stimulation. So if we go back to our previous example, likely Tommy was trying to avoid doing the homework assignment, which he got by throwing the desk against the wall. So when we're thinking about this, we allowed Tommy to escape and we reinforced the behavior throwing desks against the wall. And so that would really, it would be really important to work with like a behaviorist of some sort, a behavior interventionist or school psychologist to develop an intervention plan. So this doesn't become a dangerous situation for the class. Self-stimulation is actually the function of behavior that's the hardest one to break. So this is when people do the behavior because it's reinforcing in itself. So for example, I've worked with someone before where they threw it was a person with autism spectrum disorder, and they threw themselves on the floor on their kneecaps really hard because they liked the feeling, and that's a really hard thing to break. And so what we ended up having to do was develop an intervention plan that we can talk about on some of these discipline techniques, right? So There's different techniques. This first one, replacement behavior, is what we used in that situation. So because the client liked the feeling of pressure on their knees, what we taught them to do was put their hands and just hold them on their knees tightly so they could feel that pressure, but without damaging their kneecaps. And so what we did was we taught them a replacement behavior or an alternative behavior that they could do that got at the same function of the behavior, right? That self-stimulation, but is less dangerous. So that's something that sometimes people do. So for example, if you have a kid with ADHD and they're tapping their pen on the wall or something like that, because they need a fidget, you might get them a fidget spinner that's not so noisy that would irritate the peers, because then there might be some sort of social influence or problems that develop from that. There's also the Premack principle. Some of y'all probably have done this before, where you say, I'm going to do this less desired thing first before I get to do something fun. So for example, I'm going to grade all these papers before I get to go sing karaoke, right? This is a great strategy and it works really, really well. But you have to have a lot of discipline to be able to do it, right? So a lot of times we'll say, hey, I must study all these words before I get to go to the movies with my friends. But then if you didn't actually do it, you still go to the movie anyway. And if you do that, then the technique doesn't work. The Premack principle actually works really well for things like you have to brush your hair first before we get to go to the zoo. So you do this first, then you do this. It's also really good, especially when kids are able to develop follow two-step directions like that, because they understand that if you just say it matter-of-factly like that, they have to do that first thing first before you go. But as a parent or a teacher or anyone who works with kids, a nanny or a child care worker, you have to make sure that you don't let them get the reinforcer until the less desired behavior is done first. There's also planned ignoring. So if the function of behavior is attention and you have someone tantruming to get attention, what you can do is actually turn your body to a 45. So pretend this is the tantrum that's going on, where you can still see them in the corner of your eye, but you're not giving them attention. And so planned ignoring, if it's attention seeking behaviors, then not providing that attention actually helps reduce that behavior. What kind of reinforcement or punishment is that? If you said that is negative punishment, you're right? We saw undesired behavior, the tantrum. So we removed our attention away from them, right? So that's negative punishment. There's also something called catch them being good. And this is where you identify that someone's doing something or a desired behavior. So you offer them specific praise for this. So in the real world, when I'm working out in the field, parent training is actually one of the specialties and the things that I like doing the most. And this is actually the very first technique that we often teach caregivers, is that we need to work on you specifically praising behaviors that you're wanting to see in your kid. And this does multiple things. One, it teaches children what to do. Two, it also helps repair damaged relationships, because if you have children that are exhibiting really problematic behaviors in the homes or schools, a lot of times there is a damaged relationship between the caregiver and the kid, or the teacher and the kid, or all of the above. And what this does is it helps the parent, caregiver, teacher be able to find the good in it. And so I always have this example of when I was taught these strategies. I actually had, my oldest was super young and I was a new parent. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try this at home. And I was like, okay, oh, I like how you're walking quietly. Great job tying your, well, they weren't tying their shoes, so that's a lie. Great job getting your shirt on. I really like how you picked up your toys, and I'm doing this. And it's bath time, and they're not even in preschool at this point. And I'm giving them a bath, and uh, there's this big spider. And so I kill a spider. I catch them now and release them, but I wasn't where I am now back then. I kill it, and my kid, I will never forget this, looks at me, good killing, Mom. And it was beautiful, right? Because I think a lot of times it's really easy to focus on negative things, and we forget that our goal as teachers, our goal as parents, is to shape behavior and to help scaffold someone's learning so that they can have a good life. And it's very easy to focus on the negative, whether it's with children or even in relationships. This is actually one of the first things that will that marriage counselors will have people doing the relationships because it completely flips the dynamic and rewires your brain. Um, and it helps relationships flow. This is actually something they do in schools too, parents, marriage counseling. It's something that goes across all of them. There's also something called differential reinforcement. So for example, if you have, let's go back to the example that this is our tantruming kid. If they're doing it, differential reinforcement pairs up the planned ignoring with the catch them being good. So you would turn like this and ignore them until they stop. And then because you have them in the corner of your eye, you turn it, oh, I like how you're sitting quiet. If they start tantruming again, you kind of move again until they stop. And then eventually you shape the behavior so that it is not what they do anymore to get the attention, because they realize, hey, if I act in this way, then I'll get what I'm looking for. There's also non-contingent reinforcement, and this is a really great one to use. And this is where you just basically provide attention to a child or to someone with no strings attached. So once I worked with someone who had a kid who was running around naked in their home every time they had company. If we were doing an FBA, the antecedent was company was coming over, the behavior was running naked. And what would you think the consequence was? Yeah, everyone laughed, right? So if we're looking at that, the function's probably attention seeking, right? They want to obtain attention. And so something that we did instead was like, anytime, actually, I'm going to step back a little bit. Anytime you work with like a client, whether it's in parent training or relationship or any sort of like intervention, behavioral intervention, or even if you're working with someone in depression, basically any therapy, you can ask them what their typical day looks like. And if they don't have a typical day, okay, what did yesterday look like? And you have them go through it. And so we had the client do that. And then when they went through all of it, their whole schedule, they realized, or we realized that there was no time for the kids, and there was not even a little block. And so the intervention that we developed first was, all right, 15 minutes every day. The kid's going to flip this paper over. It's going to be a certain color. And that's when you know that you need to take 15 minutes and you're going to play. The kid gets to direct the play. You don't get to control the game. You don't make this a learning experience, nothing like that. And they did it, and they thought it was like, oh, this is not going to work, not going to work. And then by the time they came back, the whole family ended up loving it. They ended up doing this. They kept, even older children started asking for this, and the behavior stopped. And that's really heartbreaking because it just was, 15 minutes a day. Sometimes it went longer, which is great. But it's very easy for humans to get wrapped up in all the day-to-day tasks and not realize that most of us are we need attention to flourish, if not everyone. So there's also corporal punishment. This is spanking. What do you think are some benefits and disadvantages? So if we're looking at the research, the only one benefit that people would say is that it stops the behavior immediately. But this is not a technique that is actually supported within the research, because disadvantages include that it can harm the relationship. It can make a child scared of their caregiver. It can actually just make the child more sneaky. So they know if they get caught, then they're going to get spanked. So they find more sneaky ways to get what they're wanting. And then long-term, kids who are spanked tend to be more aggressive than kids who are not. So the book also talked about resilience a little bit, but didn't really define it. So resilience research began in Hawaii, and I don't know what you all know about Hawaii other than what you see about like resorts and things like that are in Instagram photos or other social media, but Hawaii has some very impoverished areas. And so what they found was that there are these kids that grew up in really difficult or challenging circumstances where their parents might had drug use disorders, or they've been super poor, and like all these really things where you think the odds were stacked against them. But what they found is when these kids became adults, that they became pretty good citizens. Most of them weren't in jail, didn't have drug use disorders and things like this. And so this began resilience research, where we look at what are some of the protective factors and risk factors for development, and are there enough protective factors to balance out those risk factors so that kids can still have resilient outcomes. And so researchers prefer the term resilient outcomes because it doesn't put all of the onus onto the child in what might be typical trauma response, but looks more into that resilient outcomes can happen if we have these protective factors to protect kids against this risk. And so this leads us into the stress response portion of the book. And there's 3 different types of stress responses that were indicated. The first was positive stress. And the book actually indicates that this is necessary. Having some sort of struggle is necessary to promote resilience in kids and the ability to be able to function even if there's some sort of threat. And in this situation, there's some sort of mild to moderate stress, but it's buffered by a caring adult who can help them move through it and regulate some of their emotions. So, for example, this could be the first day of school, it could be the first day in a new role, could be asking someone to a dance, right? So these are things that might get your heartbeat up, but they're long term aren't going to have negative impact on you. There's also tolerable stress that can happen as well. These come from adverse experiences that are more intense in nature, but short lived and can usually be overcome. So, for example, this would be the death of a loved one. A lot of times, even if it's painful, this is something that can be overcome for most people, especially if you have caring adults who can help model this. And it's really interesting for me because there's a lot of college students who have not had to experience what it's like to lose someone to death. And so sometimes college is when this happens. A lot of times, if they haven't lost them already, students will start losing their grandparents and things like that. And then we have toxic stress. This is excessive stress that exceeds a child's ability to cope, especially stress that so this would be really bad stress. This can have long-lasting effects on the body. This is something that could be abuse. Your body uses cortisol as a stress hormone. If there's chronically stressed kids, actually the cortisol levels can deplete, which can influence brain development. And so this is not a great place to be. And so these are my references for some of the materials that were included in the reading. And there's some other stuff in your module materials for this week. So make sure to go in and watch some of the videos and activities that I have to help with your learning. So I look forward to learning more with you all, and I hope you have a great week.